Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is Matthew Ho. He is here to talk about Israel, some of the recent events that have happened. He's also here to talk about Ukraine and Russia having other options in the war, and the current governments involved in the Ukraine war how they have long sorted this war. It's great to have you here again today. How you doing, Matt?
Good, Louis. It's nice to see you.
So for anyone who doesn't know Matt, feel free to check out our previous interviews. We did 2 on Iraq, we've done 1 on Afghanistan, and we've also done 1 on Ukraine. And he has a wealth of knowledge, as he obviously worked for the State Department and was deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq in different ways. But so for the topic today of Israel, which I didn't entirely plan to do, thought about just kind of speaking about Ukraine, but obviously this kind of, really happened in the news recently. So I wanted to get your thoughts about Israel, Hamas, and all the different sides. But before we kind of get to the kind of Israeli side of it and kind of the crimes that they've committed and do, I wanted to get your thoughts on Hamas and their recent attacks. So what is your view on Hamas's recent actions? Is it justified, or is it just kind of understandable, or where do you fall on it?
Yeah, certainly it was inevitable. I mean, as many other people are saying, this was inevitable. If you occupy and subjugate and humiliate a people, this is what the response is going to be. There is going to be an armed backlash, and that's what we've seen for decades, for generations. This is just the latest iteration of that. It's quite frankly really amazing at how in the West we can pretend, and I say we in a general sense, right? We can pretend that history has a start date. So I don't know what this will be called, but say it's called the October 7th War or something like that. Nothing that has come before matters. And we've seen that over and over and over again. Certainly in the United States, World War II doesn't begin until Pearl Harbor is attacked on December 7th, 1941, which for you guys in the UK might be a bit of a shock, as well as for the Chinese and for, many, many others. But certainly we saw that to great effect with 9/11. Where history did not occur before 9/11. There was no precedent or antecedents. There was no reasons for what occurred. And I think your point, Louis, is very well made and very well taken about, is this justified or is it understandable? And I think many people will say it's understandable as opposed to justified. Certainly what we have seen, the atrocities, the horror of it, while it may have been inevitable, such a thing was going to occur. Is it justified? Absolutely not. Just as Israel's response, the mass bombing of Gaza that we're seeing and what's more to come is understandable, but not justifiable. I thought this about, I've spoken about this with regards to the 9/11 attacks, where I had this chance to sit with for an interview on Al Jazeera with, now I wasn't prepared to talk about this. I sure thought before. Now I can't remember his name, of course, but with a member of the Taliban's cabinet from 2001, and his view on what occurred with the United States attack on Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks, and his trying to get his fellow Taliban leaders to understand that George W. Bush has no choice. That while you may say that it's not justifiable to attack Afghanistan, which is a country that wasn't involved in the 9/11 attacks, that was Al-Qaeda, it wasn't the Taliban, it wasn't Afghans, that even though it would not be justifiable to attack Afghanistan, it is understandable why the United States would. The political pressures, the real political pressures on George W. Bush basically presented George W. Bush with no other choice for political reasons. Were there other choices he had? Was it absolutely horrendous? Was it awful? Was it a tragedy and crime of epic proportions, what occurred after 9/11? Absolutely. But the political realities, what other options did George Bush have? And I mean, so that was something that a Taliban commander, a Taliban leader, a Taliban minister was saying, that understanding of it, right? And I think you have that here where it's understandable what occurred, not justifiable, but certainly understandable based upon the history, based upon what had been occurring, and based upon what I think the Palestinians, whether they be in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, in Gaza, whether they be Fatah or Hamas, what they view as the likely future, what's possible for them. And when they see no other avenue, and based upon decades of historical evidence why there is no avenue, and of course the way the Israeli government is structured now, and particularly, you can certainly understand why they would choose a mass attack like this, going forward.
Yeah, and again, when I say understandable, I mean kind of from obviously their perspective that
Mm-hmm.
they become desperate. They have suffered, the Palestinian people in Gaza and, overall for so many years that these type of events are going to happen. But obviously you can't justify killing civilians. And again, on that, just, because again, there's lots of kind of debate around this. So obviously when you've talked about George Bush there, you said obviously he actually does have options, but the political pressure around him, actually really limits that. So with Hamas's attacks here on civilians, could they have not put those towards, Israeli military or political targets rather than civilians? Or is that just not an option due to, Israel being so much stronger? So where do you kind of fall in that, kind of going down, rather than going down the avenue of civilians actually targeting kind of the people who make the policy? Where do you kind of fall on that?
Right. There was some of it is just the reality of warfare where this is going to occur. This is what war looks like. It's a uncontrollable force that makes people the agent of war. War is not the agent of a person or a people. It's the agent. People become the agent of war, and so war exists for its own purposes, and people get swept up with that and controlled by it, manipulated. So these types of atrocities are common for war. And certainly the Palestinians will point to the various atrocities of the Israelis for decades now, including this past year, where they have just endured really, really harsh conditions. I mean, almost 250 Palestinians shot dead by Israeli security forces in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, this year before October 7th. So that type of rage that builds up then as well from that allows for these types of things to occur. And certainly, whether or not it was part of the plan to go and murder people in this fashion is unknown. Maybe in time we will see whether or not that was a directive that was, go and slaughter as many as possible. It doesn't make sense from a strategic purpose, right? Of course, it certainly undermines your argument that you are a resistance because you are. I mean, so if you look objectively at it, but again, I mean, I'm not the one who's been occupied and subjugated and humiliated for decades and for generations. I guarantee you, many of the Hamas fighters that crossed over into Israel, many of them have family that have been killed or hurt by Israeli military action. Many of them have brothers who have been killed, or how many of them witnessed what occurred in 2018 at the March of the Great Return, where Israel shot thousands upon thousands of Palestinians who were peacefully protesting, killing 200, wounding tens of thousands, basically, otherwise, deliberately shooting them. How many of the young men who went to fight, who went across the border this past weekend for Hamas, had witnessed that, had taken part, that had lost people, or now have family members who are maimed for life because of it, right? As well, then of course the airstrikes, all these types of things that then provide that justification, if you will, for what they are going to do in return. And so this becomes acts of retribution. Certainly, the Israelis say what they're doing in Gaza now is retribution for the past weekend. The Palestinians, the Gazans, the Hamas will say what occurred over this weekend was retribution for A, B, C, D, E, F, G, stretching back through their grandparents' time, through their great-grandparents' time at this point. So, this idea of violence begets violence is nothing new. It's biblical. And I think we certainly have to look at this through that lens of violence. And so the idea then is that if things continually get worse, if violence begets violence and that violence spawns deeper and more grotesque forms of violence, what is coming in a year, 5 years, 10 years, if there is no political solution to what has been occurring?
You actually kind of took the words out of me. That I was literally about to kind of say that again, going back to what you said. It depends where you start history. So since Hamas has done these attacks, a lot of people obviously in the news, on radios, and just kind of the general population, justifies Israel's reaction, even if it does kill civilians, because they see it, an eye for an eye. But like you said, if you put it the other way around, Hamas will say, well, we've killed your civilians because you've killed ours.
Right.
Just like, again, with kind of the war on terror, the, US and NATO countries obviously, bombed civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq. So then people come out of that and then murder civilians in, capitals across Europe. And then they use that justification. But then because they do that, everyone turns back on them and the history starts from there again. And as you said, from a strategic point of view, it doesn't obviously seem kind of the best tactic, because from kind of what I've seen in the UK, obviously different in the US, most people were kind of taking the side of Israel because of the way Hamas did their attacks, even if they kind of don't agree with the events that led up to it, of what Israel does. That kind of has been shelved because they, see this as they murdered civilians. That's a terroristic act. So
Right.
Again, just before we get on to kind of Israel's actions over the years, because there are many, just kind of final couple questions on Hamas. So obviously it is designated as a terrorist organization by many governments, including the US and the UK. So what is your kind of perspective on Hamas? How do you see the organization, and obviously kind of the fact that it was elected, the government, am I correct? Not the government, but elected in Gaza in 2007. So
Right.
How do you see Hamas? Is it fair at all to call it a terrorist organization, or is there, just elements within it that do these kinds of acts? Kind of what you alluded to before. Was this a policy, or is it kind of individuals in this taking it upon themselves? So what's your kind of view of Hamas?
Well, it's a bit of a Frankenstein's monster in the sense that it wouldn't exist if there was no occupation. And what we see so often is that this occupation, subjugation, humiliation of people almost always leads to people turning to extremism for relief, for rescue, for resistance. I mean, you saw that certainly, say, in Iraq, where the American occupation forced the Sunnis to turn to Al-Qaeda, because who else could they turn to, right? I mean, so you've seen that in, I think, a variety of settings. But what you also have to understand, though, is that these people who are turning to these groups, it's because these groups are available. And the reason why they're turning to these groups, again, is the occupation, the brutality. There have been studies after studies that show the reason why people support these groups, whether it was the insurgencies in Iraq or Afghanistan, the various militia and extremist and terror groups all throughout Africa. United Nations did a big one in 2016 or 2017, showed 3 out of 4 people who joined the militant groups in Africa, across Africa, not just one, but multiple groups. 3 out of 4 of them joined those groups because they have had family members that were killed by government forces or by foreign forces. So it's not like they're joining because they are ideologically driven. It's not because they're joining because they believe that they are going to have some reward in heaven or in paradise. This is most of the people in these groups are not religiously or ideologically motivated, just as we saw that even with the most extreme form of the suicide bombers. What we saw with suicide bombers, they are not doing this because they believe that they are going to get 77 virgins in paradise. There might be a couple that do, but the majority of them are doing this because they feel this is the best way they can protect their people, that this is the best way they can help end an occupation. They are seeing it as a form of sacrifice to defend their people. That is what we've seen over and over and over again, particularly with, say, the suicide bombers that were attacking us in Iraq. when I was part of that occupation. This idea of history, though, is really important, right? Because while in the West, we will try and forget the inconvenient history, try and simplify it, try and make it as binary and certainly as Manichaean as we can. For the people involved, as we were discussing, the history is what's motivating them. So how many of those young Hamas fighters this weekend who went into these Israeli southern villages, went into villages that their grandparents, that the Hamas fighters' grandparents had been from, that the Hamas fighters' grandparents had been expelled from, violently expelled from. So in their mind, they were liberating these villages that have been taken by force, by gunpoint, by murder from their grandparents. That's the historical justification for what they're doing. And the Israelis certainly have their historical justifications and all their individual and community reasonings for why they act the way they do. It's important to understand all this. And then this, of course, gives us a sense of where will this go. And I know you asked about Hamas in general, and I got off on a tangent there. Hamas is an organization that comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's an organization. This is documented in the late 70s, the 80s. The Israelis decide that what they're going to do is they're going to try and cause splits, try and cause friction and fractures within the Palestinian resistance, and they're going to start supporting the more fundamentalist groups. And certainly you've seen that occur in other Western policies, the formation of Al-Qaeda using the most extreme radical religious reactionaries to fight the Soviets. And that Frankenstein's monster gets out of hand. In this case, you saw it as well in Afghanistan too, there's a lot of evidence that the Islamic State in Khorasan, the Islamic State chapter, if you will, in Afghanistan, how they come about in 2015, 2016 was by bringing in Pakistani Taliban fighters into Afghanistan to try and split the Afghan Taliban, right? Try and cause dissension and fracture within the ranks of the insurgency, within the ranks of resistance. And that, of course, becomes the Islamic State in Khorasan. So you have these examples where this has been widespread, this idea of trying to divide and conquer, this idea of trying to place people within a movement to disrupt it. And this is what the Israelis do by favoring these fundamentalist groups, one of which becomes, I think it was 87, becomes Hamas. And there's other things where you could see the hand of the West and of Israel creating just a disaster, in this inept meddling that occurs. So in 2006 or 2007, there are elections in Gaza, and at that point there was a robust Fatah movement. Fatah comes out of the remnants of the PLO. They are the ones who run the West Bank, if you will. They are the Palestinian Authority, incredibly corrupt. When I was in Palestine a number of years ago, Louis, whenever we were someplace where might not be overheard, the Palestinians pointed the finger at the Palestinian Authority as the prime problem, right? They looked at them as not just as corrupt, but as collaborators. So when they're talking to you out in the open, you talk about what's going on, they would, of course, denounce Israel and everything else. But when you were someplace a little quieter, they would just drop Israel and they would denounce the PA, right? But what happens, though, is that you have these elections. It looks like Hamas is going to win, and the United States, this is an initiative pushed by Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State at the time, moves and urges Fatah to stage a coup, basically, and take Gaza. And what happens is Hamas defeats them and takes it themselves. and you've not had for a number, one of reasons, many other reasons, but for that's one of the reasons why you've not seen elections in Gaza since, and you certainly see that hold by Hamas in an authoritarian manner. I'm no fan of Hamas. I mean, certainly their beliefs, how they treat their people. I in particular say with regards to women and LGBTQ rights, certainly this is not a group that I align with in any way. They are more than a fighting organization. They run the city, or they run they run Gaza, and they do all types of things, from running the schools to running the hospitals to running the fire departments, but also too they are the political structure as well as the military structure. I mean, I think you can look at that and say, okay, I don't agree with them, but I also have a bigger disagreement with an occupation, with a refusal to allow people to have self-determination, for a continued violation of international law, for continued war crimes. So I favor seeing the ending of the occupation, some justice administered, over my qualms with Hamas regarding their human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. That's certainly something that troubles me. But what troubles me more is what Israel has done to the Palestinian people for 7 decades now.
Yeah, again, I think you made a good point in there. When you're under occupation, or you're resisting or trying to overthrow a foreign government, it's normally the most radical people who are the best fighters. They're the most radical and basically willing to die for it. As you said, in the 80s, when the US, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the UK backed the Mujahideen against the Soviets, it was the most radicalized version of them, as they're the ones willing to die for it. Again, in Syria, which maybe we could touch on a bit, just Israel's kind of hand in that.
Mm-hmm.
But in Syria, again, the strongest fighting forces, ISIS, al-Nusra, which is obviously strongly linked to Al-Qaeda, and all those other groups, were the strongest fighting force, as they're the most brutal. They're willing to do anything. So again,
Right.
with Hamas, if you're a Palestinian, and you obviously want to break the occupation, you might end up backing kind of groups that are the more brutal types, and from the West can be seen as terrorist maybe types, but they're the people kind of willing to do the dirty work that maybe not normal people kind of have are willing to do, basically. But
and these groups often too, for reasons that you would think would be counter to their views, to how they would operate, they're the ones more likely to seek out foreign support. Which is, you would think that these groups that are more radical, more reactionary, would push away any type of foreign support, right? Would see the danger in that, would be against their historical narrative, certainly against their who they view themselves as. But you see that they often accept foreign support more readily than what you would call, say, moderate groups, and that's certainly a term, right? That I think most of us flinch when we hear that word moderate, particularly when it's juxtaposed against Syria. But you see that, and then of course you have nations in the Middle East, if we're going to focus on the Middle East, that have arms of their government that are devoted to supporting these types of groups overseas. So both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and then the other Gulf monarchies to a lesser extent, have formal and informal organizations that support these groups, right? So if you are Al-Qaeda or Nusra or whoever, you have a great vein of support coming from the Gulf monarchies, from Turkey, right? I mean, it's part of their foreign policy. It's how they try and achieve results outside their borders, by supporting these groups in order to, create instability, to try and conduct regime change. Certainly the Iranians have been doing this since 1979, 1980. Part of this idea is how they help export. This is one of the great myths of the Soviet Union. Certainly the Soviet Union had ideas about exporting communism and worldwide revolution. And there's truth in that, not to the extent that the West made it out to be, But that was always the great fear, was that the Soviets were behind everything. And was there some truth in it? Yeah, but the Americans certainly were, to a greater extent, doing those things as well. So what you see is, you see that willingness to accept foreign support in these groups, so that, say you are the Sunnis in Iraq and you have nowhere to turn, and there is this Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is actually quite small, but they've got a ton of money behind them because the Saudis are giving them everything they want. Well, who are you going to turn to? Because you're up against the Americans, and as well as the Shia and the Kurds to a degree. And where else can you turn? And that was where you saw the success, if you will, in Iraq by American policy, was when that was realized in late 2006. We start talking to the Sunnis and we start asking, what are your grievances? And they say, you're occupying us. Give us, what do you want? Well, give us back our cities and our towns. Let our people control us and include us in the government in Baghdad. You usurped us. And while we know we can't go back to that position, can we at least have our cut, our fair share? And we say, yeah. And they dropped Al-Qaeda, like a hot rock. And I remember it occurring. I was there, witnessed it occurring. And they literally, in every city, would say the Al-Qaeda guys are over there in that building there. And then we'd send in, commandos or drop a bomb on that house, and there'd be no more Al-Qaeda in this town or in this city. And it was that easy, because all we did was we recognized why the Sunnis were fighting, which was apparent, of course, and gave them some other options and gave them back the land that they, all these types of things that fed their legitimate grievances, we answered. And when they realized they no longer needed to be aligned with Al-Qaeda for survival reasons, they gave up Al-Qaeda in a heartbeat. And then, of course, we saw what happened, how that unraveled, right? How, particularly after 2011, the Shia-dominated government, the Kurds to a lesser degree, start really preying on the Sunnis again. And what can the Sunnis do? But they reach out to help. And who is that help going to come from? It's going to come from the Islamic State. Of course, the Islamic State, backed by the United States and its allies to a degree.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now, you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them.
Right. I mean, it's just this cycle that keeps occurring, but very understandable how and why it occurs.
Yeah, no, definitely some good points in that. So kind of going back to the Israel kind of Palestine dynamic. So under the Geneva Code, armed struggle is allowed if you're occupied by a power or a colonial power, and there's specific resolutions that, literally explicitly say South Africa, Palestine, and mention them. I think one of them was 3535, or there's quite a few that specifically mention them, and the armed struggle is allowed against a foreign occupier or colonial power. So obviously Palestine have the right to that, but I would be correct, I assume, that what Hamas has just done by killing civilians wouldn't count under that code, or I'm guessing it's only towards political military targets rather than the civilians.
Exactly. War crimes are war crimes, regardless of the justification or the cause or the antecedents, and it doesn't matter who started the hostilities. All sides are bound by those international laws, those definitions of war crimes. So certainly, what we saw this past weekend was war crimes. The idea of massacring those people, the way it was conducted, all of that, it would be considered a war crime. So yeah, it's you have that. Like I said, we have that understandable nature of it. But then the other side of it too, besides the fact that they are war crimes, is that strategically and politically it does great damage. And again, easy for me to say sitting here. I'm not the one occupied and everything. I'm not the one whose family has been subjected to this for generations. But and maybe this was the calculation for Hamas, that it doesn't matter. It's all gone anyway. We're never going to get the support of the Americans. We're never going to get support. We're never going to change the minds of the Israelis. But what you saw happen was you saw in the last couple of days, now you're going to have this national unity government in Israel, first time since the 1973 war. So where you have this really fractured, divided Israeli political environment, you now have a solidification of that, a coalescing of it. They're coming together, right? I mean, the same thing in the U.S., and I imagine in Britain it's just as bad. The support for Israel is now unshakable. I mean, it really is unshakable. Even the progressive members of Congress who had been somewhat good on Israel are staying away from this. At best. Others, some of them have said some things that people are upset with, and two members of Congress who have pointed out the Israeli apartheid system, one of them being Rashida Tlaib, who is Palestinian herself. And they've both the amount of abuse and hate and the volume of what's coming down on them is enormous. So this idea of what do you gain from such an attack? And you have to, of course, look at the political and the strategic and what's gained from this. And it's still to see what comes. Maybe they have some type of plan, the Hamas, that they want to lure the Israelis into a ground fight in Gaza. Maybe that's the reason why they took hostages, because they know Israel will come in. But, I don't know. I just see where it's going. And what does this do? Because ultimately you come down to what is the political change that's possible? And has this past few days made it impossible for any political change to occur for a generation? That's my estimation sitting here right now talking about that list with you. Maybe in a week or two things will look different, or a month. But right now, I don't see after this how there's any political movement forward to help the Palestinians for a generation, maybe 10 years, a generation, longer than that. So this is where I come to with it, where it is. It's very frustrating to see this. And of course, the horror that has been committed against both peoples, but the horror that the Palestinians are going to endure going forward is just, as we're talking, the power plant is shut down in Israel. And for those of us in the West, we think, oh, what's the big deal? You can't watch your Netflix. That's what, and we freak out when that happens. I certainly do, right? Our deprivations from that. But but this means the hospitals can't function. The water system is down. All these things, like the power is really out, like kind of thing. And so the second and third order consequences from that in terms of health, hygiene, sanitation, you could see a cholera epidemic. And things like that will occur even if Israel was to stop bombing right now, which they won't, and who knows how long they will continue for, and who knows if they will send ground troops in. And so the destruction that is occurring is likely only to continue for a while. And you have to look at this and you say, well, is this worth what Hamas is getting out of this? Is this worth that cost? Or are they doing this simply for the theater of it, for the PR of it? There is this? Are they doing it to bolster their own political internal support, to coalesce their own political structure? To, how can you say anything against the resistance after we've had all these martyrs? And if you believe the Israelis, which I don't think there's any reason not to believe them, 1,500 Hamas fighters are dead outside of Gaza. So certainly, how can you speak against them? They went out to do this for you, right? So was that the purposes in all this? So as we try and understand why they did this, and certainly they point to the reasons for it: continued abuses of Palestinians, the desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right? I mean, all the as long as my arm. But what were they trying to accomplish? What were they trying to gain? And comparing that to the cost of this, the enormous suffering. I mean, you concern is, why did the leadership make this decision?
Yeah, so just quickly before we let's get to kind of the Israeli kind of reaction and then kind of Israel side of this. We've given about half hour kind of to the other side of the argument, so people can kind of get both perspectives. I think you've been pretty kind of fair in what you've said. I mean, just kind of, the comments you just made there. Again, we will have to kind of wait to see why Hamas did this. People kind of point to maybe it was because Israel's government was at, a point of division, the protests, the current, Israeli-Saudi Arabia normalization. Is it to derail that? Is it, as you said, maybe because Israel's reaction is going to be so strong, they can gain something from that? Who knows? But so before we kind of get on to other kind of previous kind of Israeli crimes and things, so what have you made of Israel's reaction so far since these attacks?
Yeah, I think, well, let me just go back to the Palestinians for one moment, because there is, you good?
Sorry, no, I literally accidentally clicked the video icon, so it turned on my camera.
I think a lot of us in the U.S. have been thinking about our genocide of the Native Americans here. And, when I've thought about this before, in the sense of the Native Americans were doomed. In the second half of the 19th century, it hadn't been clear before. It was clear then that there was no defeating the United States. There was no defeating the white empire that was moving westward. They would be conquered, and at best they would be assimilated, and if not completely cleansed and destroyed. And the calculations then of what do you do? And I don't think anyone looks back at the Native Americans and said that their decision to fight rather than to accept the situation, accept the conquering and everything else, was the wrong decision. So I think that type of perspective is helpful to me in terms of trying to figure out why Hamas did this. I try and be an objective, but at some points that type of objectivity is worthless. And certainly, my heart is with the Palestinians. I've been there. I mean, over my shoulder here on the wall there next to the poster of Assange is a photo from in Hebron where we're being shot at by the Israeli border police. So certainly my heart is there. It's just that as you look at this and you try and figure out what was trying to be accomplished, you run into dead ends, I think. But maybe it was just nothing more than that they wanted to fight, that they needed to fight, that what else could they have done but fight? And maybe that's the case here. With the Israelis, their response, I think similar to what we were saying before about George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks. And with Bush, I don't mean that political pressure was there, that he had to continue an occupation or put troops in, but in the first month or two after 9/11, the political pressure was there for him to respond. And so certainly I don't see how the Israelis can have anything else from their population, the desire for vengeance, their desire for retaliation, desire for revenge and retribution. I mean, that's very common in our societies. That's who we are as a people. That's part of the human experience. And Israel has been no exception, of course. There are, I think, also, though, this idea of Hamas's decision process, fundamental military principles don't do what the enemy wants you to do. And I think you look at this and you say, did Hamas do exactly what many in the Israeli government, many in the Israeli military and Israeli society wanted them to do. Many in the US and the UK. There are plenty of people in London and DC that are overjoyed at the prospects, the opportunities now available to Israel to, as they would say, and some are saying it, put an end to this Palestinian problem. And the use of genocidal language in the U.S. Congress, I'm sure it's the same in your parliament, but in what's coming out of Knesset and the Israeli cabinet as well. This is serious stuff. This is very serious, these proclamations about killing them all, to simplify it. So did Hamas then play into that? Because you've now given carte blanche to Netanyahu and his government to do whatever they want in Gaza. I don't think they could get away with dropping a nuclear bomb, although there are some Israeli lawmakers suggesting that. But up to that point, they have the support, and you're seeing that with the President of the United States standing unconditionally with Israel, and certainly all the members of Congress. Israel can kill as many Palestinians for the next couple of weeks as they want to. So, I mean, the Israeli response, I think, about as predictable as the Hamas attack was inevitable. And so just the question of how much does Israel want to get sucked into Gaza, I think there's probably many cooler, calmer-headed IDF officers and Israeli politicians who see that danger of getting stuck in Gaza and what would occur there in terms of that urban fight. But I think they are going to be, their voices are much smaller in number than certainly the number of Israelis who see the opportunity in destroying Gaza. And so, yeah, we'll see what they choose to do. But from everything I've seen and everything I'm sure you're seeing and what's being reported, we're only seeing the beginnings of this operation, of this campaign.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's been some very strange language. I mean, you've heard, members of Congress, say like things like "finish them."
This is not just an attack on Israel. This is an attack on America, because they hate us just as much. And what we have to understand is this is the reason that we have to unite around making sure our enemies do not hurt our friends. America can never be so arrogant to think we don't need friends, just like we needed them on 9/11. That's why Ukraine needs us when Russia's doing this. That's why Israel needs us when Hamas and Iran are doing this. And I'll say this to Prime Minister Netanyahu: finish them. Finish them. Hamas did this. Iran's behind it. Finish them. They should have hell to pay for what they've just done.
We had the Israeli defense minister literally call them animals. And, some people refer to terrorists as animals, but I mean, you can't refer to a whole population as animals because of what few of them obviously did. And he's obviously come out and said, there's going to be a complete siege of Gaza, no electricity, no kind of everything. And again, if you read, the Geneva Code and the United Nations kind of international law, collective punishment is completely obviously not allowed. And obviously that would be collective punishment. Right. Just because Hamas has, murdered Israeli civilians doesn't mean you can punish the whole population. And again, Gaza is obviously 2 million people. So that's an insane amount of people to collectively punish. That would not be accepted in our country or any other countries, so it shouldn't be any different. I mean, also things like Benjamin Netanyahu literally posted a video on his Twitter of videos of Israel bombing Gaza, and you'd think maybe he might put in the caption something like, these are military targets at Hamas or something, but it's just a video, just of Israel bombing Gaza. Looks like quite indiscriminate and just standard kind of buildings, which is very strange for the prime minister to post. I don't think the UK or the US would even do that themselves. Right. So kind of just taking it back a step, we've kind of laid out the events that have happened briefly, obviously on the Israeli reaction, but obviously again, history didn't start now. So what was kind of the lead up to these events? So can you just give people a brief history of kind of Israel's founding? Again, we don't need to go into massive detail, just time-wise, because there's other kind of things on Israel I'd like to go over. But can you just kind of give people the brief history of Israel because they were only obviously founded in 1948. It hasn't actually even been 100 years. So can you just give people kind of that background and kind of the events since then, just briefly?
Sure. I think you start in that late 19th century with increased Jewish immigration from Europe, particularly, say, Eastern Europe, where the Jewish people were subjected to all sorts of crimes and pogroms and massacres and constant persecution. So you start seeing this movement to immigrate to Palestine. It's certainly you have after World War I. The implementation of the Balfour Declaration, which was the British government's call to make Palestine a Jewish homeland, for a variety of different reasons. And then so you see increased Jewish immigration following that in the 20s and 30s, to the point that you really start to see major Jewish political structures being formed. They existed before. There were Hebrew newspapers and things like that. In Palestine, up until that point, was a majority Arab country, and majority of them were Muslims, but a good many Christians, but there were also Jews, and they intermingled and they lived next to each other, and there was a mixed community. It really was, and so you start seeing the creation of the political pressures coming from the increased presence of these immigrants, the stress on the country that was absorbing them, the people that were absorbing them, and the desires of those who were coming in to take, right, and to build and to grow. And it comes to a head, and certainly it had started to come to a head before the Second World War. But after the Second World War and the Holocaust, you then see further immigration of Jews from Europe, but as well, you see this pressure, a guilt, if you will, to do something for the Jewish people, a guilt from the Europeans that we didn't do enough, we let this happen, which is largely true in many ways, certainly in the U.S. as well. We took in very, very few Jewish refugees in the 30s and 40s, in the U.S. So this idea then of establishing a Jewish homeland, at this point, though, you've already had Jewish resistance, terrorism, if you will, because they were blowing up hotels and things like that by Jewish resistance group, a Jewish insurgency. And at the same time, you had that pushback from the Arabs, the people who felt that they were being dispossessed. And so after the Second World War, the newly formed United Nations creates this idea of splitting Palestine into two, a Jewish nation and an Arab nation. And it's rejected. Famously, this is what people who defend Israel say, that the Palestinians had an opportunity for their own state in 48. The reality is that, yes, the Palestinians did reject the deal that was offered them, but it was a terrible, terrible, terrible deal. It's as if someone came to your house and said, I'm going to let you keep your bedroom, but I'm taking everything else. That's the deal. I mean, it just was a terrible, terrible deal. Why would you expect them to take it? So that leads into the war, Israel's accession as a nation state. It leads that from there. You see the wars with its neighbors, wars that were launched by its Arab neighbors to conquer and defeat Israel. I mean, there is a lot there, but what you have in 1967 is you have Israel take and really expand its borders, including the West Bank and including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And so that's the present situation where you've had those areas under occupation for decades now, for 56 years. And that constant occupation, which is a violation of international law. It's a war crime. Israel has been settling those areas, massively settling those areas, continually whittling down what Palestinians actually live in. It's something like in the West Bank, Israel controls 83% of the water aquifers. So it's not just what you can see, but even what's underground. The Palestinians have no ability to travel. They cannot have an airport. They have no access to the sea. Even Gaza, which is on the sea, the Israelis control the sea. It's blockaded. Palestinian fishermen can only fish out of Gaza into places where the Israeli Navy tells them they can fish. And then of course you have uprisings, you have resistances, you have the two intifadas. So you have a resistance to Israeli occupation that spikes the violence over the years. And this continually goes on, and The cruelty of the occupation increases. The deprivation and the immiseration it causes increases. And, you've had a series of say in Gaza in the last 20 years, I think 5 different wars, as they're called, where Israel has killed thousands upon thousands of Gazans, bombed the city relentlessly. And I think this is the latest iteration of that. But what you've also seen is you've seen a refusal to negotiate, a refusal for any political process. And that's what ultimately, between the cruelty, the violence, the humiliation, and the complete belief that any political negotiation is possible because there's not any, then you have this, well, the only choice we have is violence.
Yeah, and also another territory they took in the 1967 Six-Day War was the Golan Heights in Syria, which, Israel literally have on their embassy thing for the Golan Heights that they get a third of their water from there. And I'm not saying doing it for resources, but you got to see that as they're taking that much water from Syria.
Right. I remember when I first learning about it, Israeli reason for taking was, well, it's because it's the heights and they shoot mortars and artillery and rockets down at us. And if you take that as the explanation, you say, oh, okay, that makes sense. They're defending themselves. But when you understand the larger picture of it, what's really there, and Israel has annexed the Golan Heights, which is a violation of international law, a violation of the Nuremberg principles, all those things. So, yeah.
Could you also just kind of lay out to people the kind of the settler policy where, there's so many videos and resolutions of the United Nations, obviously about Israelis demolishing Palestinian homes and basically just taking them to build more settlements for Israelis. I know I've kind of briefly said it there, but can you just kind of describe that policy for people?
So that occurs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Israeli military, Israel occupied Gaza until 2005, I believe, and that's when the Israeli military and about 10,000 settlers or so pulled out. But the occupation, what you see in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is exactly that. It's a decades-long disposition of homes. You see these stories that occur repeatedly of Palestinian families that have lived in homes for generations being told they are no longer the owners. As I said before, the aquifers are a good example where it's the Israel controls the water. To get a building permit is impossible. So what has been done has been a structure has been created, a false structure, a facade that there is some type of legal system there, but it's crooked, it's rigged. There's no, if you're a Palestinian, you're arrested by the Israeli military, you go to an Israeli military court that finds 99.5% of people guilty. So it's all a farce. But it's structured. And I think people try and shy away from this imagery because it is so sensitive. But it's similar to the ghetto type system, right? Where with the Nazis, where they portrayed these ghettos as being peaceful, wonderful places where everything was administered correctly, and the Jews who had been put there had all the resources they needed, and they were happy because they were by themselves, and that's what they really want. And there's a legal structure so their grievances can be redressed. And again, the sensitivities of it, noting that, but you see the similar types of apparatus in the West Bank and East Jerusalem that allows the occupation to thrive, and it curtails criticism from outside of Israel, but it just completely destroys and denies any hope for the Palestinians. And so you see these things of where, well, they'll demolish a home, which they do regularly, the Israelis, or they'll demolish a school that was built. And then when asked why you demolished that school, well, they didn't apply for a building permit, or they did apply for the building permit and building permit was turned down. And, they were never going to get a building permit. The Israelis were never going to issue one. So it's you bang your head against the wall with these things because it is such a charade. It's so farcical. It's such just a one giant mass of mendacity, right? But it's specious. It sounds good. So back here in the U.S., you'll talk about the home demolitions that occur regularly by the Israelis or the Palestinians, and they say, well, those people are just building stuff without getting the permits they needed. You can't do that here. If we did that here, if you built a whole, I mean, and it's just that, so that the veneer of the lies that are stretched over this allow the occupation to, not receive the scrutiny it probably does, but not receive the scrutiny it deserves.
Yeah, so I was speaking with Miko Khalid. So I know obviously you know him. He is an Israeli. He was born in Israel. His dad fought in the 6 Day War. He was in the army. His granddad was involved in the declaration of Israel's founding. His family had a long history, and we spoke about a lot of kind of the kind of things the Israelis do to the Palestinians, and he spoke about literally how when they do demolish the houses, they go to them first, and if they don't do it, then they make them pay for the demolition. Right. They have laws where literally a few years ago there was a bill to basically give not Palestinians in like the occupied territories, but Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship to give them equal rights as Israelis living there who could have weren't born in Israel but can have citizenship because they moved from somewhere like New York, and they've rejected the bill of equality for actual citizens of Israel. I mean, obviously recently it's become less stigmatized to call it apartheid. Mm-hmm. Obviously it has been called that for many years. People in South Africa say it's a worse type of apartheid than they experienced.
Right.
Do you see any other way to describe Israel as like a colonial state, an apartheid state?
No, absolutely not. I mean, that's exactly what it is. You've had two Israeli former ambassadors of South Africa describe it as apartheid state. Most recently, the former head of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, described it as an apartheid state. When you're there, it's very clear. There's a road for Israelis to drive on and a road for Palestinians to drive on. This big sign on an Israeli road, if you go, basically says, if you go on the Palestinian roads, if you go in these Palestinian villages, you risk death. I mean, that's how it's portrayed. Miko Khalid, he talks about this. He talks about the first time he ever went to a Palestinian village, which was, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers from his home, right? But the first time he ever went to a Palestinian village, he was terrified. So there's that what supports the occupation with this colonization is, this narrative that these are lesser people, that these are savages, right? That these people are dangerous. Those people out there in the wilderness, right? You have to be very careful of them. I mean, that's the message that's there. You see I realize I didn't talk too much about the settlers. You see the settler communities as well, where they're built, how they're built. They're defended by the Israeli army. And so you have the violence that's inflicted upon the Palestinians. Again, 250 Palestinians killed this year prior to October 7th, including about 45 children shot dead by Israeli security services. That's ongoing. It's constant. But the humiliation also occurs in other ways. There's a degrading that occurs. So when we were there, we had to go. We were in East Jerusalem, and from my friend and I, we had forgotten something. We were in Bethlehem, so we had to go back to the hotel in Bethlehem. So we took a bus, and when we were coming back from Bethlehem into Jerusalem on this bus, we had to stop at a checkpoint. And Mike and I, two Americans, right, who don't belong there, we're not from there, we didn't have to go through the checkpoint. It was only for the Palestinians to go through the checkpoint. So foreigners didn't have to go to a checkpoint, but the people who lived there did. And I will always remember this until I die. This young woman, this young Palestinian woman who I was sitting next to and talking to, and she was in college and she had like a big, chemistry textbook and everything else, and she got off. And Mike and I got off and we went through the checkpoint to be in solidarity with them. And I remember the looks on the Israeli soldiers' faces were annoyed that we were doing this, right? But they ultimately, I don't think, cared really. But this young woman, she said, they do this to us every day. Every day they humiliate us, and that type of, what that does to a people, right? And you see that over and over again. Every day it's a humiliation like that. How does that not cause resistance just not to exist, but to continually expand and grow. And when that resistance finds no avenues other than violence, what do you think is going to happen? And in the longer it goes, violence gets worse. So the atrocities that are occurring over the last several days will be met with further atrocities that are justified by these atrocities. So as awful as what Hamas did to those people at that rave, as awful as what they did to those people on the kibbutz, as terrible as what Israel is doing now in terms of the way they are bombing and targeting neighborhoods, wiping out entire families, well, that then is going to justify the next wave of all of this. I just don't. It's horrible. It really is. And where this goes, and what a year, 5 years from now, we'll sit and talk about this and where it will be. I think it'll just be the same, only worse, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So we obviously coming to the end of the hour. I know you got to jump off soon. Obviously, we didn't touch on Ukraine. We might as well just save that for another time. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But I think it was important to talk about Israel here. And, again, you made great points there. You see so many various videos of Israelis and, in the new government, which has kind of been described as kind of more right than it kind of ever has been.
Right.
Just kind of outward racist comments, not trying to hide it at all, genocidal kind of comments. Even the defense minister's putting the word animals at the end of a sentence after saying you're going to completely siege basically two people.
And I saw an Israeli major general use the same phrase today. So maybe there's I don't know Hebrew, maybe there's a word in Hebrew, a particular word in Hebrew they're using, but that seems to be common, at least in some things you're hearing this description of them as animals. Yeah.
You could be right there. Obviously, with translation, different words can have different meanings. But again, even when they speak English,
right, they use that.
Comments. Just kind of last question or so. I mean, again, we didn't kind of get round to some things. So I've kind of been reading a lot on Syria recently, and the interesting thing, kind of this happening now with Hamas and Israel, and countries around the world describing them as terrorists. Obviously, Israel had no problem with working with terrorists in Syria. You have so many comments from, head of the Mossad, head of, the IDF and different things saying, and I think his name was Michael Oren. He was the Israeli ambassador to the US, just outwardly saying they'd rather have the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra rebels in Syria than the Syrian government or Iran.
And what I'm going to say is harsh, and perhaps a little edgy. But if we have to choose the lesser of evils here, the lesser evil is the Sunnis over the Shiites. For the reason
You're
I
not
mentioned
speaking
before.
for me.
Okay, it's a lesser evil. It's an evil, believe me, it's a terrible evil. Again, they've just taken out 1,700 former Iraqi soldiers and shot them in a field. But who are they fighting against? They're fighting against the proxy with Iran that's complicit in the murder of 160,000 people in Syria. You can just do the math. And again, one side is armed with suicide bombers and rockets. The other side has access to military nuclear capabilities. So from Israel's perspective, if someone's got, if there's got to be an evil that's going to prevail, let the Sunni evil prevail. And I'm speaking entirely for myself.
Right. So they had no problem working with terrorists, literally out in the open. You can hear them in forums and in articles. Straight up say they'd rather have the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, the people who Al-Qaeda attacked their biggest ally, the US, in 2001. But kind of obviously there's a clear obviously media bias towards Israel. I'm sure there's genuine people who do kind of just take Israel's side naturally. Just even normal people in the general population do. As there's kind of that Christian, kind of Judaism element of it, and they're the only democracy in the Middle East. If you're Israeli, obviously, and not Palestinian. But how much kind of influence do you think the Israel lobby has on kind of comments about Israel? How much kind of a stranglehold do they have over the media and kind of just Western governments kind of in general?
Oh, it's massive. It really is. It's really quite massive. The role that they're able to play, similar to say the gun lobby in the United States in many ways. But even with the gun lobby is limited primarily to Republicans, while the Israel lobby has an effect on both parties. It's it extends beyond the politicians as well. It's certainly their ability to influence how the media talks about this war. There was a couple months ago, maybe or so, and I can't remember which outlet it was, but it was a major American outlet, the Washington Post or CNN or something like that, that described Palestinians being killed by bullets or something like that, where they completely had censored the fact that these people have been, as if bullets had just been in the air and entered these people's bodies. I mean, and you certainly saw that with, say, the American media's response to Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist who was murdered by the Israeli army last year. The response to that has been nothing. I mean, nothing. I mean, whatever response that they've made it's minimal. It's so pathetic. And this was an American Palestinian journalist who was murdered by, and very similar with Julian Assange as well too. Like the amount of defense for one of their own and their willingness to be to censor themselves so that they can be in favor with either the American national security establishment or the Israeli lobby is really quite remarkable. And so the way that you see the media talking about this, I think so many Americans, and maybe it's the same in Britain, but so many Americans have no idea of the history of this. And if they will, it's complicated, and give a both sides kind of thing when it's really not complicated at all. It's the question of occupation and colonialism and the people fighting back and in all the terrible things that come from that. And that's how I think this last week should be viewed. Like that's not the big story, what's happened this past week. This is the consequence of what the occupation has done, of what these violation of international law and war crime, this oppression of a people has produced. But I think most Americans are unaware of the number of Palestinians that Israel has killed over the last decade or the last 2 decades. It's just not something that's reported on by the U.S. and the Israel lobby has that effect, that they are that powerful. It's just not a question of campaign contributions to political leaders. It's a question of having a sway in corporate boardrooms and a position within culture that enables them to do so. And so one of the ways you see is with the evangelical churches in America that are incredibly pro-Israel. The Israel lobby has been able to align themselves with these evangelical churches in a way that's just quite startling. And they've done so. And these evangelical churches have their religious reasons for it, but some of it's just cultural, or some of it's because it's ties to the Republican Party, what have you. But yeah, the effect is that most Americans have no idea of what has been occurring there for the last many generations.
Yeah, and again, just for some of the media semantics, has kind of been pointed out recently, kind of the way the BBC framed a post. It said, Israelis killed in one sentence, and the next it says, Gazans, Palestinians who died in Gaza.
Right.
So Israel are bombing Gaza, so they died. But,
right.
As who killed Israelis were killed. Just little things like that are framing that, they've taken the time to do that, to try and kind of, psychologize you into framing it a specific way. But I'll let you jump off because I know you have to go. I mean, if you're happy to just recommend some books after the show, I'll put it in the show notes. Don't worry about doing it now, but thank you for coming on. I always appreciate your time. I think we covered a lot of the subject there quite objectively. And, if people want to kind of see more of the Israeli kind of crime side, check out my recent interview with Miko, who's obviously an Israeli, where it happened just before these events, but we focused kind of entirely on Israel's apartheid system, Gaza, his own experiences. They go into a lot more kind of detail about that side. But thank you for coming on, Matt. It's always great to chat to you, and hopefully we can talk soon about Ukraine and some of the articles you've done then. Is there anything you want to point people to, any recent articles you want kind of people to know about?
Well, I mean, people can follow me on Twitter at Matthew P. Ho, or I have a Substack, which is Matthew Ho. .substack, I think is what it is. So, but people can find what I do there.
Yeah, no, I'll put up all of that on the screen in the show notes. I'll put those Ukraine articles that I cited that we didn't discuss. Yeah, thank you for coming on, and I hope to speak soon.
All right, thanks so much, Louis.